Welcome to the One Day at a Time Recovery Podcast, where my guests share their stories of addiction, how they recovered, and the tools and practices they use to stay sober now. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Loving it.
Yes, listen, I know you in real life. We hung out at the She Recovers convention last year. It was so much fun to
Oh my
spend some
God,
time
that was
with
so
you.
much fun.
It really was. And I thought today we're going to talk about anger, how to know if you have an anger problem, 4 ways to identify it. We're going to talk about 5 ways to manage it. But before we jump in, you want to just tell us who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm Michelle Ferris. I am in San Jose, California. I'm a licensed psychotherapist and person in recovery. So I definitely understand what it's like to think you don't have a problem with anger and actually realize that, holy cow, I have a lot. And I had to really learn in recovery that that wasn't necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
So a lot of my work comes from my own personal experience, plus, my work with clients. But I love everything recovery. And I think anger is such an important topic because we tend to want to avoid it.
And we want to avoid it. And it's so interesting because even in like 12-step literature, they talk about how
Right.
anger is best left to people who are better qualified to handle it. And I think maybe that's a little bit of I don't know.
Hmm.
It's anger in my estimation and is a normal response to it's like an appropriate response to certain types of
Right.
situations. So, but I have noticed over the years that I've been sober that sometimes I'll be working with a woman and we'll get to the 4 step and I'll be like, okay, who are you resentful at? And she's like, I don't feel anything. Like they can
Yeah.
identify sadness, but not
Yep.
anger. Why do you, in your opinion
Hmm.
or estimation, why does that happen?
I think the process of recovery, we have to thaw out emotionally. I know for me, I did not have my anger for a really long time. But I had anxiety, I had stress, I had other forms of intense emotion that I didn't really recognize as being anger until later. Resentful, I could relate to. But I think that's the thing is we can't really control when that starts to bubble up. But I think I remember Bob Earl talked about this years ago in all his tapes is, 3 to 5 years in recovery. Usually that's when your childhood stuff's coming up, your relationship stuff's coming up, and possibly anger. And I think for me, I think it was later than that because I was a master stuffer of my anger. But, you know, we can't rush it. Like if somebody listening to this doesn't relate to the word anger, I'm guessing you might relate to the word anxiety, overwhelm, or resentful, because all of those can still be very similar in the body.
What about depression? I feel like depression is a
Hmm.
lot of times I hear that people, when they're depressed, they actually don't feel anything. And that
Yeah,
to me is like a sign of dissociation. And it doesn't surprise me that it takes 3 to 5 years for some people to start feeling their anger because it
right.
takes a while, especially if you don't get professional help, to sort of
Hmm.
reconnect with the
Right.
trauma and pain. It takes some time
Yeah.
for stability to occur and maybe some safety for those feelings to start to arise.
Oh, yeah. And I think depression is really common when you get sober or in recovery because all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, this is my life. Right. And we've
Right.
hit a bottom to get here, and it's usually not pretty. So I think feeling anxious or depressed is super, super common. I mean, the big book refers to outside help. Right.
Yeah.
And so, that's part of what we need to be mindful of in our own recovery is every journey might be a little bit different.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with how to know if you have anger. And I thought this was I'm grateful that you brought this up because I think especially for women,
Yeah.
like when you first get sober, a lot of us don't have a voice. Like we don't even know. It's like,
Yes.
how are you? It's like, I don't even know. I don't even
Right.
know how I feel. When I first
Right.
got sober, I would have all these feelings, and I have this sort of imagery of. Have you ever seen one of those pictures, those sepia pictures of a switchboard operator?
Oh, yeah.
It's always a gal, sitting in front of a wall of plugs or holes, and she's got all these plugs, and that's
Right.
how I felt. Like, I was like, "I have this plug and I don't know where it goes,"
Mm,
because I
uh-huh.
couldn't identify my
Right,
feelings. And so,
right.
all these feelings are jumbled, and I feel like as women, we're taught to be nice, and
Yes,
like, anger is not an appropriate emotion for a woman, otherwise she's a bitch. We're taught to be nice
right,
and all that stuff. So,
right.
how do you help people identify whether they have an anger problem?
So I think especially with women, but if they stuff it, like if someone hurts your feelings, if somebody crosses your boundaries, what do you initially feel? Because most likely you're going to have a gut check, you're going to have muscle tension, you're going to clench your jaw. There's going to be some sign that tells you, that didn't feel right, and that is the beginning of anger and resentment. So being able to identify, like, are you stuffing? Because as women, we are taught to stuff anger, like, just suck it up, be nice, be helpful, take care of everybody else. But we all know when we really want to say no rather than saying yes. Like, there's a gut bodily response. And that's what I would say to start paying attention to. The other really common sign if you have an anger issue is that somebody in your life is concerned about it. They've said, you really are kind of angry, or you kind of blow your top. And a lot of times it's easy for us to dismiss that because we think, That's just them. They're nagging me," or right, make it about them. But really, if you have a loved one or a partner that is saying that to you, that's a major thing to look at, because if they're noticing it, often we don't notice our behavior as much as our partner does, or our family. So that's a sign. And then if you find that you're reacting to the little things and you're just pissy, like, God, stop that, right? I know I can get that way sometimes. And I have to check okay, am I doing self care? Am I setting boundaries? What's my self talk like? What's going on that I'm more pissy than normal? Because that's a sign that, hey, you know what? Something is brewing and I need to pay attention to it. So those are kind of three common things I'd have your peeps look at.
So it's so interesting that it starts off with like a physical response. Like you
Often
mentioned the
it does.
clenching, gut
Hmm.
check, like you like ouch, like your body is aware first.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of them. Should we go there with the other four?
Well, I actually have a question.
Yeah.
When you're talking about your partner saying,
Hmm.
"Hey, I have a problem with your anger or whatever." What
Yeah.
about passive aggressiveness? Is that a sign of anger?
Oh, for sure. That's more of the person who can initially stuff their anger, not say anything in the moment, and then, but pretty quickly it leaks out into a sarcastic comment, or maybe somebody asks you for a favor and your response is, well, of course, don't I always help you? So I'm saying yes, but my tone is like, F you, don't ask me. Right.
Yeah.
So if,
Yeah.
if the words and behaviors don't match, but yeah, passive aggressive is a super common form of anger because we may not feel comfortable out directly being angry, but we want to look good. But again, passive aggressive, it's always going to leak out in something indirect and kind of mean and snarly because we can't hold it in anymore.
I think it's so interesting. I learned somewhere along the line that if to be nervous if somebody receives bad news well. Like, you have to go to
Mm.
a friend and you're
Uh
like,
huh.
"Look, I have to address something with you," and you say your thing, and they go, "Oh, okay, I see, whatever." And because someone's
Uh huh.
initial response is typically not their long-term response. So if I have to deliver bad news and they take it well, it makes me nervous because I feel like it's gonna and come back
Yeah.
and bite me in the ass at some point.
Well, that is really important because sometimes we don't have our feelings in the moment. So if you have that gut check, because I know you trust your intuition, like, go back, right? A couple of days later and just, hey, I'm just checking in about our conversation, wondering if you had anything else come up. Because often the person may not get that they're
Ooh.
angry or upset, but a couple days later, they might be like, that didn't hit me well. And now I'm upset. But they may want to ignore it and not say anything because the moment's passed.
That is such a good point. I was thinking when I was asking the question, I was thinking, in terms of what could they say,
Mhm.
but I love this idea of what could I say? Like if
Yeah.
like this is no, this is good. I'm actually gonna use totally gonna
Well,
use
because 'cause
this.
you're the one picking it up. You're the one that's aware.
Yeah, yeah. So if I deliver bad news and they receive it well, I might let them sleep on it and then the next day check in and say, "Hey, I'm just checking on in on you. You know, that was a difficult conversation. Did anything
Yeah.
come up for you?" Just like give them a little
Uh-huh.
space to address it.
Yeah, and if they
Yeah,
still don't own it, they might not be ready, or
they
they
might
might
not be
not
ready.
be ready in their own journey to look at deeper feelings, and that's okay. We all have our own timetable.
Yeah, okay, so then I could say, if not, then I could say, "Okay, well, if something comes up, my door is always
Yeah,
open. I'm always happy to talk about this, or I'd be willing to talk about it or whatever."
totally,
That's
and then we have to
so
let
good.
go, like, you know what? It's not your problem if they're not ready, Like,
Right.
sometimes for me, I that makes me nervous, like, "Uh-oh, I know the person may be upset, but they're not willing to talk about it yet."
Yeah.
That's when I really have to practice detachment because it's like, I made the offer, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But then I have to let it go if they're not willing to go there.
That's true. Yeah, because it does require courage to talk about,
Oh,
if
yeah.
I get my feelings hurt and I'm angry, it takes a lot for me to be able to be like,
Yeah.
excuse me, what you said 2 weeks ago really hurt my feelings, and I've been
Yeah.
stewing on it ever since."
But you know what? I'm so glad you said that because I wanna normalize that because it's a very advanced skill to be able to say in the moment that you're hurt if someone just hurt your feelings. Most of us are gonna stew on it, think about it, ruminate, and come
Yeah.
back. And that's okay in the beginning because 'cause we're not ready until we're ready.
Yeah, actually, it's so funny because I would joke around that my hurt button is on delayed reaction. Like,
Yeah. Oh, yep.
I don't even know that my feelings
That.
were hurt sometimes until later, and I think it's that initial
Mhm.
freeze
Yes.
or
Yes.
dissociation. It's like,
Yep.
and I'm sure we have all kinds of reasons of why that happens from childhood programming and blah blah blah, but
Right.
yeah, I don't always notice it you're right. I don't notice it in the moment. It's on delayed reaction sometimes. And then I walk away and I go, gosh, I should have said this. I should have said that, you know, all that stuff.
Right.
I forget that, oh, you know what? You can go back. and be-
Absolutely. And I think when we're stuck like that and frozen, usually that means we've grown up with some type of rage that kind of makes us freeze in the moment because we don't feel safe. So it's not really, we don't feel comfortable enough to say how we feel because we're still processing what that other person just did.
Yeah. And I feel like when that happens to me, like, um, I a lot of times question myself. Like,
Me too.
should I be mad about that? Was that
Right.
mean? Was that am
Right.
I wrong?
Yeah.
I go into a whole bunch of self-doubt. Like,
Yeah.
is this valid? Is this feeling valid? The answer is yes, your feelings are valid.
Always. Because if I sat down with you, right, and you and I had coffee and you told me the story of why you were upset, I would be like, yeah, I totally get it. And that's what we do for each other, but that's what we have to do for ourselves to really honor that if you're feeling angry or hurt or resentful, there's a reason. It's not that you're too sensitive. It's not that you're blowing
Oh, I hate
something
that.
up. I know it's really invalidating. And even if we are overreacting because it's an emotional trigger, there's a reason we're doing that because we all have triggers and we have to learn to manage them. And that's part of anger too.
Yeah. The whole, you're too sensitive, you're
Oh, I
too
know.
much. Those are all
Yeah.
manipulations to invalidate somebody's feelings, which is so damaging. I get why people do that. They don't have skills either. So I'm glad we're talking about this. It's like we examine both sides of the street
Yeah.
and come up with it. For me, it was just having the language a lot of
Right.
times. Like you just said it, like to validate somebody's feelings. Like you'd be like, okay, I totally get it. Like not defensive. Like, oh, I
Hmm.
could see how you'd feel that way. I could see how you'd feel that way are such magical words.
Right.
Like I see you. So even like a qualifying question, like, oh, I think you said this. Do I have it
Yep.
right?
Yep. That's
Uh,
so helpful. And checking
Yeah.
out any negative assumptions. Like if I'm in conflict with somebody, I'm most likely assuming something, whether it's their intention, what they said to me, and I have to check it out and go, is this what you meant? And 99.9% of the time they come back and say, no, that's not what I meant at all. Great. But it clears
Good,
the
because
air
you're an
instead of,
asshole.
that's right. Well, then we're off and running. We're halfway there because we're operating off of an assumption of what we think they meant versus actually checking it out.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really good. Okay, so we were gonna go over
Oh, yeah,
4
four
ways to
ways.
identify it.
So
So,
the first one is negative thoughts and assumptions. I can't do this. I'm not good enough. Every life isn't fair. My partner's a blank. Whatever that is, it can be negative self talk about yourself, life in general, or other people. That's a huge one for most of us. If you find you're getting angry or irritable, check your thought because I guarantee you there was some thought in there that all of a sudden shifted your mindset. I know years ago, my husband, I asked him to do some chores. I'll never forget. And he sighed. He went, and in my head, I said, he's such a baby. And luckily, I had enough recovery not to say that. But what I realized was even thinking that lit the match. And I was
mhm,
so mad. And I realized, oh my God, what I tell myself has so much power. I got to stop doing that. I need to not interpret what he did in a negative way because that's what set me off, not what he actually did.
mhm,
So self talk and the negative assumptions are huge. The second one is emotions, right? Obviously, what are we feeling? Are we feeling irritable, annoyed, confused, sad, numb? It's not just I'm angry, right? Sometimes it's the feelings or the stress that happens that is a buildup. The next one is physical signs. This is pretty much the easiest one people are going to relate to: rapid heart rate, muscle tension, clenched jaw, uh, knots in your stomach, right? Headache. All those are really great signs because your body is literally saying, woohoo, pay attention. I'm like not happy right now. And so we just have to be willing to go, oh, okay, what is that? Right? Instead of, oh, I'm reacting. I don't know why I'm reacting and I must be wrong. You're not wrong. Your body is literally trying to tell you something. And then the last one, which I think is really interesting, is behavioral signs. I had a roommate in college. The minute he was stressed out, I could always tell because he went for that cigarette. And I was like,
oh.
okay, he's mad. But we all do things. Sometimes people pace, sometimes people start swearing, blaming, throwing things. What are the things you do when you start getting upset? Because that those four things are going to help you kind of recognize it early.
Man, okay, so I kinda wanna dive deeper into the 4. So the negative thoughts and assumptions, that's sort of when you were
Mhm.
talking about that, I was thinking, "Oh, that's why they say don't believe everything that you think."
Right, right.
We get these thoughts and we don't take a pause to see if they're actually true, right?
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
and often they're from childhood. They're old tapes that we haven't flushed yet.
Yeah, and, from childhood, so it's like, hearing a sigh from somebody, like, maybe you had parents that argued, and that was the trigger.
Right.
Slamming doors, um, was the trigger, so sometimes
Hmm.
loud noises and things like that, but it's like you get a cue, and then the brain starts to go with, "Oh, they're mad,
Yep.
they're" like, I was wondering, like, when your husband sighed, like, did you ask him, like, "Oh, I get the feeling you're, what's up with the sign? Are you busy? Are you
No,
stressed?"
because my reaction was so overdone, like overreaction mode, that I didn't even have to talk to him because I knew I'm like, okay, I'm way off base here.
Oh, okay. Alright, we're just identifying anger at this point.
I just identified at that point. But
Okay, so we're just identifying.
mhm.
So the negative thought, so it does take some practice to be able to be
Oh
like, "Oh,
yeah,
wait a minute," that's like the awareness being present. It's like, "Oh, wait a minute. There's the thoughts." Tell me, what was the second one again?
emotional signs. So how are you feeling emotionally? Whether it's stressed, annoyed,
Okay.
irritable, confused, numb. Sometimes we start off and we're
Numb.
numb, right? We don't
Yeah.
have any feelings, and then all of a sudden we de-thaw and start getting upset.
Okay, I really relate to the either the heart racing, the physical
Uh-huh.
signs, like the
Yep.
heart racing, like instant, like 0 to 60
Yep.
heart racing, just blind rage,
Right.
or numb, especially depending on what sort of environment I'm in. If I like, I remember when I was
Mhm.
in sales, I'd be at work, and customers or vendors that we worked with,
Mhm.
when it comes to like money and pressure and
Mm.
work and stuff, oh my gosh, that is such a pressure cooker. I would
Mhm.
like just go totally numb.
Yeah.
It was either heart racing, mile a minute, or absolutely
Mhm.
nothing, and I would just go silent,
Yeah.
which was really not good professionally. And then the behavioral signs, I think that's when people start acting out. It's like that's when
Mhm.
we reach for the sugar, the
Yep.
cigarette,
Yep.
those of us in recovery, it was drugs and
Vaping,
alcohol.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
oh,
mean,
yeah, all
there's
that stuff.
yep.
I love that. Okay, so those are great ways to identify that, yes, I have anger.
Yes.
And then
And we
what?
all do. We just have to find the goal really is to identify 1 or 2, because there's usually 1 or 2 that immediately show up for you, and that's gonna help you go, "Oh, I'm going there. I need to do
Okay.
something," versus, "I'm gonna ignore it and let it build because it's not that bad yet." That's the biggest mistake we make with our anger, is that it's not that bad yet, so we don't wanna deal with it.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you, we're going to talk about 5 ways to manage it, but and I wonder where this fits in this conversation.
Yeah.
I have two grown boys, they're almost 21 and 24. And I noticed somewhere along the line that I would mask sadness with anger. So
Mm,
if like one of my sons had some issues with drugs and alcohol, and
sure.
shocker, I know. And my response was to get angry, but when the
Mhm.
anger subsided, what I really was scared and sad.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so and then I had another son that, if sometimes when he gets sad and it's like he's what's that? It's like a self-inflicted injury. I
Mm.
get when he does it to himself, like I get
Yeah.
angry instead of
Yeah.
but really underneath all that, I'm sad. So where does that fit
Right.
into this conversation somewhere?
Well, I think anger is such a powerful emotion. It makes us want to take action and it makes us feel powerful. So sometimes
Yes.
it is an easier one to feel for some of us because maybe we don't want to feel the powerlessness of grief and sadness and disappointment. So that anger gives us that rush of energy to either try to control something that we're not supposed to control, right? Or fix something or someone, because that's what we think is our solution versus, wait a minute, this is my emotion that has to do with me, not them. And that's where sometimes the disconnect is. We assume we have to get the other person to change so we're feeling better. And that's just going to increase your frustration, babe.
Yeah, it's not I've gotten better, but yeah, that's not fun.
No.
Okay, so let's talk about 5 ways to manage anger instead of
Yes.
displaying anger.
So this comes from my Calming Anger live Zoom class that I do a couple times a year. One is you definitely have to identify your early warning signs and get
Okay.
really comfortable, whether that's certain self-talk statements like life sucks, life isn't fair, my partner's a blank. You really want to get comfortable being able to spot it early, because the second step is you're going to rate your anger or stress from 1 to 10. One is super minimal, like it's not a big deal. We all have a little bit of stress. But when it gets into the 3, 4, that's when it's kind of obvious. And we're kind of going, okay, I can tell I'm upset, but it's not that bad because I haven't lost control yet. So that's the time most people ignore it. But of course, if we ignore it, it's going to continue and that number is going to climb by the end of the day, or sometimes it takes several weeks, depending on how good we are at stuffing it. The next step is you have to challenge negative thoughts and assumptions. I mean, even if you don't identify those in your early warning signs, there's almost always assumptions we're making about the other person that is fueling our anger and resentment. They did this purposely to hurt me. They don't think I'm smart. All that head stuff that we have to identify and own as ours. Because every time I check out an assumption, it's wrong. And I'm a therapist.
Wow.
You'd think I'd be right. But that's the power of negative self-talk,
It's
right? Is
hard.
we just go to the worst case and go, I know they think this of me. And it's almost never true unless you're with a narcissist, then it might be true.
Yeah,
Um,
the one that always gets me is, someone is either condescending to me or,
mm,
trying to get one over on me.
yeah.
Those
Yeah.
are those are
And
tough
that's
ones.
so powerful because these certain people that you feel that way more about because maybe they have narcissistic tendencies, maybe they are more toxic, but not everybody, right? So that's where we have to really be mindful of, okay, oop, this assumption came up. How accurate is this? Well, my friend
Mhm.
really cares about me. She's in recovery. She's never lost it on me. That's probably not going to happen. Versus somebody who's narcissistic that gaslights you a lot, you might that assumption might be a warning sign for you to go, I may not need to process my anger with that person because they're going to use it against me.
Oh, wow, yeah.
I mean, I don't tell everybody that I'm in a relationship with when I'm angry at them because the first question I ask myself is, are they safe and are they willing to do conflict without blame? If yes, far out, I'll do it. If no, I won't. I'll do some writing. I'll take it to my therapist. I'll do something else because there's no point in trying to process your anger with someone who isn't open and willing to hear it and not blame you for it.
Right. Do you find that it's better to, process your anger with somebody who is safe so that you
Hmm.
can kinda get to, like, the core issue first and then sort of, um
Hmm.
'cause I feel like, if I'm angry at somebody,
Right.
it's like my head says makes all these assumptions, and I can't figure it
Yep.
out by myself. It's like it's that, like you can't read the label from inside the jar. Like when I'm
Right.
angry, I'm in the angry jar.
Yeah. Well, that's why this goes perfectly with step 4
Okay.
is we have to practice some form of self-soothing or get support. So the
Ah,
minute I know I'm a 3, 4, or 5, I have to remove myself because if you're in that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, right? Your
yeah,
heart rate's elevated, you're not thinking clearly, you are most likely going to understand and misinterpret what's being said. So we really have to go, okay, if I'm angry, the first thing I have to do is remove myself. Because unless I have the self control to practice the tools and not blame or shame the other person or myself, then I have to go. And, kind of a cheat sheet is if you don't have control to talk about the situation, but you're bubbling up, right? And oh, it's right there, go in the garage and vent there. Go somewhere in your house that nobody will hear the poison coming out of your mouth and let it all out. Because that way you're safe. You haven't done any damage, but you don't have control yet, right? You can even go in your car. Nobody's going to follow you in your car because sometimes before we learn these skills, we need a place to put it. Writing is great, but if you're really amped up, you may need to take a walk first, right? Call a friend, do something physical to get that energy out of your body.
so when you say, like, go to the garage and or go sit in your car, are you saying that you should, like, scream or
If you well,
call make a make a
in the
call?
beginning, if you have to, you have to. It's
Yeah,
really just what we're doing is we're removing ourselves so we don't hurt our family or loved ones and putting it in a place that's safe, which is by ourselves. We could yell at
yeah.
God. We could, whatever. We wouldn't necessarily want to do that at a meeting, right? Or yell at a friend because we're super in a rage. Sometimes I think handling it yourself, at least initially, to kind of let yourself maybe take some breaths, maybe look at your self-talk, maybe talk out loud why you're super upset. Something that immediately deals with why you're upset. Because the other thing I notice people do is they'll say, "Well, I listened to a podcast." And I'm like, "Okay, that's good. If what the activity is, it distracts you from the anger so you never actually go back to work the feeling out, then by the end of that podcast, a couple hours later, you're most likely going to get there again. And I don't want that."
Yeah, my knee-jerk reaction is always to pick up the phone and, like,
Yeah,
call
me too.
someone,
Me too.
just call a friend, like, I have friends that are safe that I can just be like
Yep.
I remember a lot of times, it would be around, like, a work situation or a friend that hurt my
Yeah.
feelings, but, like, if it
Yeah.
was something at work, I'd call my husband and I'd just be like, "Oh my god," and just, "Bleh," just kinda
Yep.
and he would just hold space for me and just let me get it all out, which was
Yeah.
nice, or
So great.
girlfriend that
Yeah.
can hear it.
Yeah.
And then it's nice to have friends who'll be like, "Okay, what is this affecting in you?
Yep.
When have you felt this way before? Is this
Right.
really about the situation, or are you rubber
Right.
banding back to when you felt this the first time? Like, when was the first
Yeah.
time you felt this way?" Maybe those
Right.
are therapist questions.
Yeah, but the fact that you have girlfriends that will do that, I mean, that's why you have the recovery you do. And that's why we urge people to build a support system, right? So
Yeah.
that they have those kind of people. Because if you call the person that hates your wife and says, yeah, she really is a crappy wife, that's not going to help. But sometimes people do that. I'm going to call so that my evidence, they're going to validate my story
Uh,
and keep me in the victim role, which we don't want.
you know what's interesting? You know what I've
Hmm.
learned is that when a friend calls about their partner, whether it's a boyfriend or a husband, and they
Yep.
call to vent, it's like you cannot, like, I never address the partner because if
Mm,
you
uh-huh.
say, "Oh, you know what? You're right. I remember last week you said, didn't he do the same thing?" You're putting them in a position to defend the person that they're mad at.
Right. Right.
So as a friend, I learned not to be like, "You're right, he's an asshole."
Right.
You know,
Right.
because then they feel the need to defend. Like, so I guess this
Yeah.
rule kind of applies to people that you love.
Yeah. I think it's a delicate balance because I mean, I'll validate for you what that struggle is, right? And if
Okay.
let's just say I know your husband really well or I know your marriage, then I would go, yeah, I could understand why you feel that way because he's done this before, right? I mean, I would
Yeah.
definitely validate it, but yeah, I wouldn't get on the bandwagon of, yeah, he's really a bad guy because he's
You
not,
should leave
right?
him.
Right. And that's the danger, man, is we get into advice giving and it's like, oh,
Ooh. Oh,
some
advice giving.
yeah, I know. That can
Took
be
me
a
decades to not do that. Remember
yeah,
one
well, that's
time one time my brother called me and he was upset about something. I don't even think it was his wife. I don't even know who he was mad at. He's never mad at it. Anyway, I
uh-huh.
got off the phone with him and I was like, oh my God, I didn't give him advice. Like that was such a win for me personally.
Yeah. It is because sometimes we feel like that's the only thing we can contribute, or we wanna control somebody else's pain so that we feel better, which
Oh my
doesn't work.
gosh.
I know.
So messy. This stuff is so
I know.
messy.
It's messy.
Okay, get support. What was number 5?
Number 5 is offer to resume the discussion after the argument if, and this is a big if, both people are calm. If
So like take a
usually
break.
well, yeah, because usually you're gonna have to take some form of a timeout, and then when you
Like
come
fuck
back
you.
yeah,
Just
no,
end this
like
discussion.
I need a break, and yeah, there's a whole process around that, but the key is in a partnership, almost always one person wants to resolve it immediately and the other person doesn't
Right.
because they need time, and the hard part
Yeah.
is I'm the one that wants to resolve it immediately, so it's harder for that person because we have to take a breath and go, okay, I have to be willing to wait because if I'm willing to wait until my partner's ready, it's going to go a lot better. But if I force it, it's not going to go very well.
Is that a gender thing? Is it the women who want to resolve it now, or it doesn't? That's not
You know,
necessarily.
I've seen men want to do it too. I think it's the one that's more direct in the relationship and not as fearful of the conflict. Those are the people that are like, I want to solve it versus men and women. But, I would bet that's an equal opportunity problem,
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose for every example that a man does that we can find a woman that does it or vice versa.
right?
Try not try not to generalize
Yeah.
gender, but anyways. Okay, those are really good ways to manage it. Um, what else do we need to know about how to resolve anger. As like, and we were talking earlier about resolving anger when it's like to yourself,
Mm,
right?
mhm,
Like
mhm,
and I think that's kind of rooted in shame. But like
mhm.
I feel like everybody, when I was growing up and going to church, they would say, oh, everybody has a cross to bear, meaning
Yeah,
everybody has an area of life where
right,
they can't seem to, quote, figure it out,
right.
right? Whether it's weight or
Mhm,
relationships or career, money, it's always
mhm.
romance, finance, or fitness. I feel like kind of falls into one
Yeah.
of those. So, and I've had these struggles where I'm like, I can't believe I'm here again. And then I
Mhm.
feel angry towards myself. Like
Yeah,
how
yeah.
does what, like, you can't run away from yourself. Like how does,
No.
and I think this kind of speaks to people that are like newly sober or trying
Mhm.
to get sober. It's like, how do you resolve anger towards oneself?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to let ourselves have it because it's really a form of regret. Because when
Mm,
I'm angry at myself, I'm wishing I would have done something better or different,
mm,
right?
mm-hmm.
And I have to go through that process of being pissed about it. And sometimes I am pissed at myself and go, God, why did I do that? But then it's like eventually you get to the point where you go, okay, this isn't really helping me anymore. So I stay there shorter amounts of time. Now I know how to get out of it because that initial, okay, I'm mad at what I did. Okay, Michelle. And if somebody else did this, what would I say to them? I'd be like, oh, I totally get why you did that. You were super stressed. You had all these balls in the air. So it's like the more you're in recovery, the more I think we can have more compassion for ourselves to realize that nobody does this perfectly. Everybody and the stress and crisis that we go through, that is a factor. And we kind of don't realize that, you know, it's really not fair for us to say to ourselves, well, we should have done it better, but I was going through this huge hard time because that makes our ability to use the tools less and we're not
Mm.
at our best, we're kind of running on empty sometimes, and so we kind of do the best we can, but it's not necessarily what we could do when we're calm and peaceful. So it's not really fair to judge ourselves for being in a crisis and not handling it better when the crisis itself is a huge deal and takes a lot out of us.
Yeah, you mentioned something about running on empty. And
Yeah.
to me, that really speaks to the importance of self-care.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Like you got to fill your own cup first. And that's why I'm sort of
Yep.
obsessive about like a morning self-care routine, a little
Mm.
journaling, a little prayer, a little meditation. I kind of came up with this analogy. It's like my self-care is sort of like a pitcher, a pitcher of red
Mm.
Kool-Aid. I use red
Uh-huh.
Kool-Aid because if you spill that shit, if it gets on anything, it's sticky and it stains forever. So it's like,
Right.
oh, when I wake up in the morning, I need to do my self-care, which is like pouring the pitcher out. Because if I don't, if I walk through my day with a
Mm.
full pitcher of red Kool-Aid, if anybody bumps into me and stuff spills, like red Kool-Aid, it's sticky. If it
Oh, I
stains,
love
it's
that.
like my words. I got a sharp
Mhm.
tongue when I'm really
Mhm.
angry. And
Mhm.
man, words are like, once that Kool-Aid gets on you, there's no, putting it back.
Oh, I love that, and I think that's so important what you're saying because there's such a big connection between anger and self-care.
Yeah.
Because in my class, my students almost always identify that they're not taking care of themselves, they're not giving themselves the time they need to unwind, and so their anger is right there.
Oh, that's interesting. So unwind sort of speaks to sort of end of the day.
Oh, yeah. I remember I would see
Yeah.
male clients in person way back when, before COVID, and I would tell them if they were super stressed coming home, I'd say, "Park your car for 15 minutes
Yeah.
and, like, breathe or listen to the music you love or do something to unwind from your day," because it's a really hard transition sometimes to go from intensity of work to intensity at home.
Yeah. That's why I've noticed that a lot, I don't know if it's a dude thing, but a lot of people go to the gym after
Yes.
work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's it.
That's
That's
really
it. So I
true.
like the idea of bookending self-care. So you do a little
Mhm.
prayer and meditation, get your mind right, fill your cup in the morning or empty your
Yep.
pitcher, whatever metaphor works for you.
I love that.
And then at the end of the day, decompress and get
Right.
physical and let your body get tired and get that all out.
Right.
I like the
Yep.
exercise too because that gives you like the endorphins and good neurochemistry. It alleviates
Yeah.
depression and anxiety. It does so much. So bookending
Yeah.
self-care is good. Tell me about your class that you have. You kind of mentioned that you do this class. What's it called again?
It's calming anger, and it's 4 weeks. I'm just cycling through one now, and, it's interesting because when I started it during COVID, I didn't know who I was gonna get, and I'm getting people who, like, you can't tell they have an anger problem. They're very functional, successful people, but they just don't know how to manage their emotions. So I think that there's such a myth between like anger management. That's such a scary, oh my God, does that mean I'm violent? Does that mean
Domestic
I'm
violence. Yeah.
yeah, and it's not. So the class I teach isn't the 52-week anger management class, though I did that years ago and I loved it. It's more like how do you manage and identify your emotions? Because I don't know about you, but I didn't learn that growing up. I mean, there's no way I learned that growing up. And now I think there's enough education that parents are probably now able to really emotionally help their kids manage their feelings. But, when you and I were growing up, that wasn't a thing.
No, it was not.
No,
It
no.
was no, my mother, bless her heart, she would get angrier and
Uh-huh.
like her anger would get bigger and mine would get smaller in the face of her anger.
Right.
And so
Right. Because you wanted to stay safe.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
We later, we all got better over time
Uh-huh.
with all that stuff, but it's not, it was like trial and error. And actually, what's so
Mm.
funny is my mom met somebody that was in a 12-step program when I was 14 and he helped her, he like gave her some tools and her anger
Oh,
dramatically changed after that. You know what,
wow.
one of the things he told her, he would
What?
say, she learned to say, that's not my job. Like she
Oh,
had a brother
love
that
that.
was, yeah, she had a brother that was batshit crazy even then. And she would try to control a situation. He kept telling her, that's not your job. She go, oh, that's right. That's not my job. That's
Mm.
not my job. And then she
And
totally
it lessened her
changed.
stress. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's just that one little
Yep.
trick really helped her to
Yep.
like let go of something that wasn't her responsibility.
Oh.
It was
Well, that's the
awesome.
thing is when we know what's ours and what isn't, that
Yeah.
also does make a huge impact because if we're taking responsibility for other people's lives, yeah, we are going to be more irritable and angry because we're overwhelmed and we're
Yeah.
not meant to do that.
It's a setup for failure, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
It's a setup for failure, but I see what, like, I grew up doing that. I would take inappropriate responsibility for, like, I have an older sister and
Hmm.
we didn't know it, but she was suffering from depression. And back then, nobody talked about that. And
Right.
so I would try to control her sadness. And, of
Mm-hmm.
course, she didn't act right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so I would get angry. And it was a mess. And then
Because you tried to fix it.
yeah, I was a fixer,
Yeah. Yeah.
hence coach.
Yeah. That's the gift that came out of it.
A gift that keeps on giving.
Right.
Oh my God. But I learned that I was trying to control her so that I could feel better
Yes.
because I felt
Yes.
powerless in the
Right.
face of her sadness.
Right.
And so I tried to control her so that I could feel better.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it was a mess, but yeah, all these lessons that would sure, yeah, if you're a parent, I say I would encourage you to listen, if you're alive, take Michelle's class because we all need, if you're hearing this, take Michelle's class. So it sounds like, do you have a wait list for the next class?
I probably should start that. Usually I start it after the fourth week, but I have a free email course in the meantime that people can do to get started, especially with
Okay.
the self-talk. And that can be super, super helpful to just get some skills on board now because,
Okay.
I usually have the class 3 times a year, 3 or 4 times. And then I have an online version of it if anybody wants that.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
And where can they find that? We should give a plug to your website.
Oh, yeah, counselingrecovery.com. Yeah, all my resources are there.
Counseling
Recovery.
recovery.com. Writing this
Yeah,
down. I'll leave it in the show notes too if you're listening and driving and you want to check out Michelle's free email course to get you started. If you're like you're in crisis, don't wait. Get some resources. Help is
yeah,
available. If
yeah,
you're
and you're
like,
not
oh,
wrong for feeling angry. We all feel angry. I mean, to
yeah,
me, it's every time I get angry now or irritable, it's like that red flag telling me something isn't okay. Someone said or done something that I'm not okay with, and I have to do something about it. Whether or not I handle the situation, that's part two, but I have to at least handle myself and how I want to take care of myself.
yeah, no, that's really important. Well, this was super helpful. I learned a lot. I picked up some new skills, which I
This was
love.
fun.
I love some new tools. So, yeah, thanks so much for joining me today. I feel like this will be really helpful, and I'll just
Oh,
encourage
good.
everybody to get that free email course by visiting counselingrecovery.com.
Thank you.
Yay.